Christmas used to be the only day that made me feel like I still belonged somewhere. Even as the space between me and my family grew wider each year in ways no one talked about, but everyone silently felt. My name is Delaney Brooks. I am 28 years old, and for most of my life, I learned how to sit at the edge of every room, how to smile at the right moment, stay quiet at the right time, so no one would feel uncomfortable with a presence that never really seemed to matter. That night, the whole room filled with laughter when my sister was handed the keys to a brand new house, followed by the reveal of a brand new Tesla that made everyone erupt into excitement. No one tried to hide their joy as she hugged Mom and turned to Dad as if this was something she had always deserved. As for me, they handed me a gift, and inside was a $2 lottery ticket. Everything around me kept moving as if that moment was not worth stopping for, and I closed my fingers tightly around it, not because I believed it had value, but because it felt like the final confirmation of where I truly stood in that family. 1 week later, what no one expected happened. I won $90 million. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply stared at my phone while the screen slowly filled with missed calls and messages from people who just days earlier could not even look me in the eye. I replied with only one sentence: "Good luck next time." Before I tell you exactly what happened after that message, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from, because this story only gets colder, more honest, and harder to handle the further it goes. Long before money ever entered the picture, the hierarchy inside my family was already fixed in a way that never needed to be announced, because it was reinforced quietly every single day through choices that were impossible for me to misunderstand. I learned very early that I did not occupy the same position as my sister Harper, because everything that mattered about our lives was handled differently depending on whose name was involved. Whenever Harper needed something, Mom would immediately adjust schedules, priorities, and energy to make it happen, while Dad treated her concerns as important conversations that deserved careful attention and follow-through. When I needed something similar, the reaction shifted. I was told to be patient to understand the situation, or to avoid creating pressure inside the home. Over time, I stopped expecting equal treatment because it became clear that the system was not designed for balance. Money made the gap more visible. When Harper had an interest, a plan, or a request, there was always a discussion about how to support it. When I asked for resources, the conversation turned into lessons about responsibility, gratitude, or timing. Mom and Dad never called it favoritism, but their actions created a clear pattern where Harper's needs were considered necessary, while mine were treated as optional. Celebrations exposed the contrast in ways that were hard to ignore. For birthdays and holidays, Harper received gifts that felt deliberate and personal, chosen with thought and excitement, while mine felt like obligations that needed to be completed quickly so the focus could return elsewhere. When Harper succeeded, the house felt louder, warmer, and more alive with pride. When I achieved something similar, the acknowledgement lasted only long enough to be polite before attention returned back to her. I adapted by learning how to exist without interfering. If I spoke up, I was told that I was too sensitive. If I expressed frustration, I was called ungrateful. If I stayed silent, I was praised for being easy to manage. That cycle trained me to avoid conflict entirely and to treat silence as a form of safety rather than weakness, because silence created peace for everyone else, even when it came at a cost to me. I also noticed how Mom and Dad talked about the future. Harper's path was discussed with certainty and structure, supported by conversations that sounded like plans rather than guesses. When my future came up, it was framed as something that would somehow work itself out without much involvement or investment. Eventually, I stopped waiting for guidance, stopped expecting direction, and accepted that I would be responsible for building everything alone. The only person who ever listened to me without dismissing my experience was my best friend Olivia, who came into my life at a time when I still believed that being honest could lead to change. Olivia never told me I was imagining things. She never asked me to be quieter for the sake of harmony. She listened, she remembered, and she treated my thoughts as real, which slowly gave me the confidence to trust my own perceptions instead of rewriting them in my head. That friendship did not fix what existed inside my family, but it shifted something important inside me. I stopped assuming I was overreacting. I stopped shrinking my thoughts before they reached my mouth. I began to understand that what I experienced was not a misunderstanding, but a system that had functioned exactly as intended for years. By the time life started pushing me toward independence, those lessons had already settled deeply. I had learned how to stand quietly in the background. I had learned how to survive without acknowledgement. I had learned how to depend only on myself without expecting rescue from people who had never planned to offer it. By the time I started living on my own, the idea of independence felt less like a dream and more like a quiet necessity, something I needed in order to breathe without constantly adjusting myself to fit into rooms where I already knew I was not fully wanted. Moving out did not come with dramatic arguments or emotional speeches. It came with silence, with folded boxes, with the understanding that no one was going to ask me to stay. I found a small place that I could afford on my own, signed my own paperwork, paid my own deposits, and learned quickly that every responsibility now belonged to me without exception. I covered rent, utilities, groceries, transportation, and medical bills without expecting support, because I had already trained myself not to ask for things that were unlikely to be given. The pressure was heavy at times, but it also gave me a strange sense of dignity that I had never felt while living under someone else's control. The distance between me and my family did not grow through arguments. It grew through routine, through unanswered messages, through invitations that never came, and through details of life that were quietly kept away from me. Harper stopped sharing updates unless it was absolutely necessary. Mom stopped checking in unless it was tied to a holiday. Dad never asked how I managed my months or how close I was to exhaustion. There was no official separation, only a slow drift that felt intentional, even when no one admitted it openly. I began to notice that I was no longer included in real moments. I saw photos online before I heard about gatherings. I learned about decisions after they were already finalized. I realized that my presence had shifted from being tolerated to being optional, and eventually to being forgotten whenever it was inconvenient to remember. Those changes were never announced, which made them harder to confront but impossible to ignore. When I did visit, the imbalance felt sharper than before. Conversations moved around me rather than toward me. Stories were already half told by the time I arrived. My chair felt like something added at the last second, rather than prepared in advance. Harper would speak confidently about plans, about progress, about things that filled the room with attention, while I measured my words carefully so I would not break a rhythm that had never been built for me. Financially, I never fell back on them. I worked longer hours without making it visible. I learned to fix problems before they became visible to others. I learned to budget in a way that felt strict but stable. I started to understand that relying on myself was not only safer but expected, because asking for help would have highlighted how far I had already been pushed to the edge of the family circle. Over time, the emotional distance became normal. I stopped waiting for calls. I stopped assuming that silence meant people were busy rather than choosing absence. I trained myself to exist without needing validation, because needing it only made the quiet feel louder. What began as distance slowly turned into something permanent, something that shaped how I saw my place in the world and what I stopped expecting from people who shared my last name. That Christmas night arrived quietly. The house looked warm before it felt warm, because warmth was something that had stopped reaching me long before anyone noticed I had started standing just outside its center. The living room was dressed in soft lights, expensive wrapping paper, carefully placed ornaments, while the silence around my presence felt like one more piece of decoration that nobody thought twice about adjusting. Everyone moved through the space as if a ceremony was about to happen, which in many ways, it was only not for me. Mom stood close to the tree with a confidence that felt rehearsed while Dad positioned himself beside her with the kind of pride that comes from control rather than joy. Harper was already seated perfectly composed, almost waiting as if she already understood that something significant belonged to her without needing it explained in advance. No one asked me to sit anywhere specific, which had always been their quiet way of telling me that I did not need a place of my own. The large gift came first presented carefully wrapped in deep glossy paper that reflected every light in the room. When Harper opened it, the air shifted. A set of keys appeared in her hands, heavy enough to command silence, shaped in a way that made their meaning impossible to misunderstand. Dad lifted his voice just enough for it to sound generous without sounding emotional. A brand new Tesla waiting outside registered detailed perfected. The room reacted instantly, not from surprise, but from recognition, because this outcome felt natural to everyone watching. Mom stepped forward to touch Harper's shoulder as if rewarding the right person for existing correctly. I was handed my gift after the celebration had already peaked, as if my turn existed only because it needed to exist on paper. When I opened it, the silence did not change. A $2 lottery ticket rested in my hand, thin, fragile, unremarkable, except it felt heavier than the key that had just been handed across the room. No one laughed. No one explained. No one met my eyes long enough to turn it into a conversation. The air simply moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. I did not react outwardly. I felt the ticket between my fingers not because I believed it meant something, but because it made the message unmistakably clear. Harper had received movement access proof of importance. I had received chance wrapped in paper so thin it felt almost transparent. Mom turned back toward the kitchen. Dad shifted the conversation. Harper began discussing delivery dates, features, color choices, things that required attention. My presence slipped back into the background without resistance. I stood slowly, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet decision that nobody bothers to stop. Nobody asked where I was going. Nobody offered to walk me out. Nobody noticed the door open behind me. The air outside felt colder, cleaner, honest in a way the room had not been. I realized that what hurt the most was not the lottery ticket itself, but the comfort they had in giving it to me as if they were confident I would accept being small without question. I walked away that morning without anger, without confrontation, without announcing anything that would have forced them to react. I left with a calm that surprised me and a certainty that I did not belong to their version of family even if I shared their name. The house behind me stayed bright. The street ahead felt quiet. The feeling in my chest did not feel loud, but it felt final. Later that night, I found myself walking alone through a nearly empty convenience store, moving slowly down the narrow aisle with a quiet sense of intention that surprised even me, because for once I was not reacting to anything or anyone. I was simply choosing something for myself with my own money that I had earned. Through long shifts, silent perseverance, and discipline no one in my family had ever bothered to notice. I stood in front of the lottery display for a long moment, not because I believed in luck, but because the simple act of reaching into my wallet and pulling out my own cash felt like a quiet declaration that this moment, no matter how small, belonged entirely to me, and when I asked for the ticket, my voice did not shake my hand, did not hesitate, and my thoughts remained calm. After leaving the counter, I moved toward the self-check machine near the entrance, holding the ticket carefully, without treating it like something magical, because at that point it felt more like proof that I was allowed to make decisions without approval. And as I fed the ticket into the scanner, I expected nothing beyond confirmation that it was another small, forgettable purchase. The screen changed slowly, then froze for a fraction of a second, then displayed numbers that did not look real to me at first, so I stood there breathing quietly while I checked the sequence again. reading each number in my head with patience instead of panic, comparing every digit with the printed line to make sure I was not misunderstanding something that simple machines rarely get wrong. I did not celebrate, I did not call anyone, and I did not allow excitement to control my thinking because the years of being overlooked had trained me to protect calm as if it were a shield. So I scanned the ticket again, then a third time, watching the same confirmation appear, feeling a steady awareness settle into my chest instead of disbelief or noise. The first person I contacted was my financial advisor, Harold, a man who had helped me set long-term investment plans long before this moment, and when I called him, I spoke quietly, explaining only the facts without emotion, while he responded with the kind of professional focus that told me clearly this was not something to discuss casually or emotionally. Harold did not congratulate me in a loud way, did not treat the situation like entertainment, and did not make promises that sounded dramatic because his concern was structure legality, privacy, and protection, which made me trust that I was not imagining the seriousness of what had just happened. So he explained the next steps in a calm voice that grounded me further. When I returned home later, nothing in my behavior changed. My phone stayed quiet. My face stayed neutral, and my conversation stayed normal, because I understood that this information was not something my family deserved to know, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had learned through experience that they only valued me when something could be taken. I locked the ticket inside a drawer that no one else could access, not with fear, but with certainty, knowing that this was the first secret that was truly mine, built from my effort, protected by my silence, and untouched by anyone who had spent years treating me as if I had nothing worth protecting. Before I had time to decide what I should do next with the quiet weight of my secret, something I never planned for slipped through the cracks of my normal routine. It did not come from my mouth, and it did not come from anyone I trusted. It came from the kind of careless moment that feels meaningless at first, the kind of moment that later changes everything. It started inside a small convenience store a few blocks from my apartment, where I had stopped after work to buy a bottle of water and clear my head. The clerk there had known my face for years, not as a friend, not as a stranger either, but as someone who showed up often enough to be part of the background. He smiled in the lazy way people smile when they think they are sharing harmless gossip, and he mentioned a conversation he had overheard earlier that day about a winning ticket connected to my name. At first, I thought he was confused. Then I understood he was not talking to me directly, but talking through me as if the words were already moving beyond the walls of that store. I left without reacting, but I could feel the shift happening while I walked back to my car, because secrets do not disappear gently when they escape. They change shape, and they grow. Within hours, the first message appeared on my phone from a number I recognized as belonging to my sister, the same voice I had learned to walk quietly around for most of my life. She did not ask whether the rumor was true. She spoke as if it already belonged to her, shaping the story in a way that placed the ticket inside the family the moment the idea touched her thoughts. By the time Mom called, the tone had shifted from confusion to assumption. She spoke to me as though I had simply been holding something that was never meant to be mine alone, using soft words that carried sharp edges implying responsibility instead of ownership. Dad followed soon after, his voice steady in a way that felt colder than anger, framing the situation as something that needed to be handled properly, which meant handled by them. The requests did not sound like requests for long. They slowly stopped sounding like questions and began to carry the weight of expectations that pressed into every part of the conversation. Those expectations thickened over time until they started to feel like pressure wrapping around my thoughts in a way that made breathing feel tighter before finally shaping themselves into commands that left no room for interpretation. They asked to see the ticket, not to celebrate it, not to protect it, to take it. They described it as help, calling it a way to manage paperwork, a way to keep things fair, a way to protect me from making mistakes. None of those explanations felt real to me because none of them had existed when I needed real protection from their absence. When I refused to bring the ticket to them, their voices began to change again, becoming sharper, more direct, more impatient. The curiosity that had filled their calls dissolved, replaced by urgency that felt like ownership. The warmth that never truly existed dropped away completely. I chose not to give them anything, and I refused to waste my energy arguing with people who had already written their own version of the truth without asking me because I understood that words would only give them something new to twist. Explaining myself would not make them listen. Defending myself would not make them stop. The calls continued. The messages piled up. Some sounded worried. Some sounded angry. Some sounded rehearsed as if they had practiced what to say before pressing send. I did not respond to any of them, and I allowed the silence to grow naturally, letting the distance between us stretch wider each day until it turned into a boundary that could no longer be crossed through noise, guilt, or force. Inside that silence, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was clarity. I understood that the ticket was never just paper and the money was never just money. It was the first thing in my life that belonged only to me, not borrowed, not shared, not taken. I kept the ticket exactly where it was hidden from hands that had never learned to hold me gently, and I kept my mouth closed because silence was the only language they could not steal from me. By noon the next day, everything changed in a way that could not be undone or softened by excuses. I did not walk into that meeting with a need to explain myself, and I did not come in looking for peace, because too much had already been taken without acknowledgement. The room felt heavier than usual, not because of anger, but because of expectation that had grown into something sharp and dangerous. My parents sat at the table with quiet confidence, and Harper sat beside them with a rigid posture that made it clear she believed this moment belonged to her. There was no hesitation in their eyes, because they were already convinced that the winning ticket was theirs, even though no one had ever asked me directly what had truly happened. They believed that what they had handed me belonged to them by default, not because of truth, but because of entitlement. I placed the lottery ticket they had given me on the table slowly, without drama, without anger, and without the need to make the moment louder than it already was. The paper looked small under the light, yet somehow it carried the weight of everything they had assumed without asking. Their eyes followed my hand as if they were already reaching for what they thought was rightfully theirs. I looked at all of them before I spoke, not to challenge them, but to make sure they understood that what came next was not emotional, not reactive, and not impulsive. I said clearly, without raising my voice, "The winning ticket was not yours." The silence that followed was not confusion. It was shock, cutting through the certainty they had built inside their minds. I pushed the ticket gently across the table back toward them, keeping my hand steady while their expressions began to shift from certainty into something harder to control. I said the words without hesitation, without anger slipping into them, and without the need to explain myself further. Good luck next time. The moment did not explode instantly. It stretched painfully, as if the room itself needed time to catch up with what had just been said. Harper was the first to break, and her reaction was not quiet or measured, but exposed, like a wound that had never healed. Her voice rose not out of sadness, but out of humiliation that she could not hide once the truth had been placed in front of her. She accused me of lying, of manipulating them, of trying to rewrite something she believed had already been decided. Her anger did not scare me because it came from a place of loss rather than power. My parents did not intervene, not because they agreed with me, but because they were no longer sure where they stood. They had built their confidence on an assumption that had just collapsed, and I could see it in the way their hands stayed still while Harper's voice filled the space. I did not argue, I did not defend myself. I did not raise my voice to match theirs. I stood up slowly and let the chair move back behind me without a sound that felt rushed or dramatic. I told them that this was the last conversation we would ever have about money, about favors, or about belonging, because I was done trying to earn a place that had never been given freely. I told them that from this moment forward, I was no longer part of a family that only saw my value when they believed they could own it. I walked out without slamming the door, without looking back, and without needing approval for a decision that had been years in the making. Months passed without any noise. The silence that followed my decision felt unfamiliar at first, yet it slowly became the most honest space I had ever lived inside. Harper lost more than her pride after that confrontation. The house she once bragged about became a burden she struggled to maintain, while the car she treated like proof of superiority lost its shine as payments stacked up behind closed doors. My parents stopped appearing strong in public because the story they told neighbors no longer had its favorite character involved. Without my presence, they lost the illusion of control that once made them feel powerful. I did not celebrate their downfall because my peace never depended on watching them suffer. I simply noticed how quiet my life became when I stopped trying to earn approval that was never truly available. I moved to a smaller place by choice, not as an escape, but as a beginning that belonged only to me. I built habits that felt honest work, that matched my values, routines that did not revolve around fear of rejection or hunger for recognition. Nobody clapped for my progress, yet the absence of noise made every small achievement feel real. Money did not become my identity, even though I finally had security. Comfort arrived through stability instead of performance. I learned how to enjoy mornings without dread, how to sleep without replaying old conversations, how to look in the mirror without asking whether I was enough. My world grew smaller in the most peaceful way because it only included people who respected my silence, my boundaries, my choices. My parents tried to reach out once through distant relatives. There were no apologies, only confusion about how I managed to create a life without their structure. I never responded, not out of anger, but because I understood that some doors only exist to pull you back into rooms you already escaped. This was not revenge. This was survival that slowly turned into freedom. Real strength never comes from proving your worth to people who thrive on withholding kindness. True growth begins the moment you stop asking for permission to become someone better than your past. Some families teach love through silence control or comparison, yet healing starts when you recognize that approval is not a requirement for peace. Walking away does not make you weak. It simply means you finally chose yourself over endless disappointment. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. If this journey felt real to you, please share your thoughts in the comments so others know they are not alone in silent struggles. I would love to read your experiences, your feelings, your quiet victories. Your voice matters here, and your story might help someone else find the courage to choose themselves too.